For over 500 years, the knight was the most feared weapon on any battlefield. Armored in steel, trained from childhood, and nearly impossible to kill, they ruled every war in Europe. Then, on a single muddy field, in a single afternoon, it all fell apart. Forever. If you've ever wondered how the most dominant fighting force in human history just vanished, stay with us. Because this isn't just a story about one battle. This is the story of the day the medieval world broke. Hit subscribe and don't go anywhere, because this one will genuinely change how you see history. Picture Europe in the year 1300. Fog rolling over green fields, stone castles sitting on hilltops like the fists of God, the sound of hooves on cobblestone, the smell of iron and leather. This was a world built on one simple idea, that the man on the horse, wearing the steel, was untouchable. That man was the knight. And for 5 centuries, he was right. The knight was not simply a soldier. He was an institution, a living symbol of power, prestige, and organized violence. The entire feudal system of medieval Europe was constructed around him. Lords granted land to knights. Knights used that land to fund their armor, their horses, their training. And in return, they fought. That was the deal. That was civilization. A boy destined for knighthood began his training around the age of 7. He became a page, running errands, learning manners, absorbing the culture of war. By 14, he was a squire, riding into battle alongside his knight, watching, learning, surviving. By his early 20s, if he had proven himself, he was knighted in a formal ceremony that carried the weight of a religious rite. This was not a career. It was an identity forged over decades. And the armor, by the 1400s, full-plate armor had become an engineering masterpiece. A well-fitted suit could deflect sword strikes, absorb blunt force, and turn away most arrows at any meaningful distance. Knights on horseback, charging in formation, were the closest thing the medieval world had to a tank. Nobody, genuinely nobody, believed that common soldiers, peasants, farmers with spears could stop them. That belief was the foundation of the entire military order of Europe. But power, no matter how absolute it seems, always has a weakness. And by the early 1300s, something was beginning to crack beneath the surface of this perfect military machine. The first warning came in 1302 in a field in Flanders, near the city of Courtrai. The French king, Philip IV, sent his cavalry, some of the finest knights in Europe, to crush a rebellion by the people of Flanders. These rebels were not noblemen. They were weavers, craftsmen, and farmers. They carried iron-tipped clubs and long spears called pikes. They had no cavalry. They had no formal military training worth mentioning. By every rule of medieval warfare, they should have been destroyed in minutes. They were not. The French cavalry charged across soft, uneven ground and collapsed into chaos. The Flemish infantry, standing firm in tight formations, cut the knights down as they struggled in the mud. Over 1,000 French knights and noblemen died that day. The rebels collected so many golden spurs from the fallen aristocracy that the engagement passed into history as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Europe noticed. And then Europe forgot. The nobility called it a fluke. They blamed the terrain. They blamed the commanders. They blamed everything except the possibility that their entire system of war was showing its first fractures. The second warning came in 1346, at the Battle of Crécy in northern France. This time, it was the English, under King Edward III, facing a much larger French force, led by Philip VI. The English positioned longbowmen, trained archers capable of releasing 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with enough force to punch through armor at close range. When the French cavalry charged, the English archers released, and kept releasing. Wave after wave of French knights rode into a wall of arrows and died. The French charged 16 times that day. 16 times they were broken and driven back. When the battlefield fell silent, over 1,500 French knights and nobles lay dead. The English longbowmen had barely moved from their positions. The disbelief across Europe was profound. The French nobility, the church, the entire aristocratic class struggled to process what Crécy meant. They didn't want to process it. The idea that common archers, men of low birth, no breeding, no chivalric training, could slaughter the flower of French knighthood was not just militarily troubling. It was socially catastrophic. It challenged the very logic that said these men were born to rule because they were born to fight better than anyone else. And so again, Europe looked away, blamed the tactics, blamed the overconfidence, moved on.
Still, the nobility held on. Still, they believed. But what was coming next would not be a warning. It would be a verdict. Gunpowder reached Europe from China through the Islamic world sometime in the 1200s. By the mid-1300s, Europeans were casting crude iron cannons and using them in siege warfare. By the early 1400s, they were getting dramatically better at it. At the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II deployed massive bronze cannons, the largest the world had ever seen, and reduced the walls of the greatest fortified city in Christendom to rubble in under 2 months. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Gone in weeks. On the open battlefield, early gunpowder weapons were slow and unreliable. The first handguns and early arquebuses took almost a minute to reload. They misfired regularly. They were dangerous to the people using them nearly as often as to the enemy. This is an important detail. Gunpowder alone did not kill the knight. Early firearms on their own were not yet the decisive weapon. But they were the beginning of a transformation that would accelerate faster than anyone expected. What gunpowder introduced, more than any single tactical advantage, was a shattering of the social logic behind knighthood. A peasant with 2 weeks of training on an arquebus could wound or kill a man who had trained his entire life for close combat. The skill gap, the breeding gap, the gap that justified an entire social hierarchy, suddenly had a hole in it large enough to ride a horse through. And the aristocracy felt it, not just in battles, but in their bones. Their entire identity was built on the premise that what they did could not be replicated cheaply. Gunpowder made that premise a lie. Warfare was industrializing before anyone had a word for industrialization. Larger armies of cheaper soldiers, trained quickly and paid by the week, were replacing small formations of elite, expensive, aristocratic warriors. The economics of war were shifting. And when the economics shift, everything shifts eventually. But if you want one moment, one sequence of battles where the future announced itself with absolute, unmistakable clarity, then you need to go to the mountains of Switzerland in the 1470s. You need to go to a man named Charles. Charles, Duke of Burgundy, known to history as Charles the Bold, was arguably the most powerful nobleman in Europe in the 1470s. His territory stretched across what is now Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and eastern France. His court was the most lavish in Europe. His army was one of the best equipped and most expensive forces on the continent. He had artillery. He had professional cavalry. He had crossbowmen and infantry trained under the latest military thinking. He had everything the medieval world could offer a military commander. And Charles was not a fool. He was ambitious, experienced in battle, and absolutely convinced that he would carve out a kingdom to rival France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Swiss Confederation stood in his way, and Charles made the decision that this collection of mountain farmers and herdsmen would not be an obstacle for long. The Swiss were something genuinely new in European warfare. They had no nobility commanding them, no feudal structure driving them into battle. They were free men, citizens of small cantons, who fought together out of political necessity and fierce local pride. Their primary weapon was the pike, a wooden shaft between 15 and 18 feet long, tipped with a steel point. When Swiss infantry formed into large, dense squares called pike formations, they created a moving wall of steel points that cavalry simply couldn't penetrate without catastrophic losses. Their discipline was extraordinary. Their willingness to close with the enemy and keep moving forward, no matter what, became legendary and feared across Europe. In March of 1476, Charles marched his army to the town of Grandson in what is now western Switzerland. His force outnumbered the Swiss defenders in the town and captured it. He executed the garrison, a decision that inflamed every Swiss soldier marching toward him in response. When the main Swiss army arrived, Charles deployed his forces with confidence. The Swiss pike formations advanced without hesitation. Charles's cavalry charged. The charges broke apart against the pike squares like water against stone. His artillery, slow to reposition, could not adapt to the speed of the Swiss advance. Charles's army broke and fled, abandoning an enormous quantity of artillery, treasure, and supplies to the Swiss. The humiliation was staggering. 3 months later, in June 1476, Charles came back. At the Battle of Merton, with a larger force, he attempted to besiege a Swiss-allied town. The Swiss relief army arrived and attacked. The result was worse than Grandson. Charles's army was routed and driven into a lake. Thousands of his soldiers drowned or were cut down. His military reputation, one of the great political assets of any medieval ruler, was in ruins. Most men would have stepped back, would have negotiated, reassessed, accepted the new reality. Charles was not most men. He was the last true believer in the old order of war. He came back a third time, on January 5th, 1477, in the middle of a brutal winter. Charles met the Swiss and their allies at the gates of Nancy in the Lorraine region of France. His army was smaller, underfed, demoralized and exhausted. The Swiss force was fresh and moved with the tactical precision that had twice already destroyed everything Charles threw at them. The battle was not long. His army collapsed. His knights, the finest remaining cavalry he possessed, could not stop what was coming. The Swiss pike formations cut through his lines with mechanical, unstoppable force. Charles the Bold died on that field. His body was found 3 days later, frozen, face down in a ditch near a frozen pond. He had been struck by multiple pike wounds, including a blow that had split his skull. His face was so disfigured that it took those who knew him personally several days to confirm the identification. The last great champion of medieval knightly warfare was found unrecognizable, alone in the frozen mud. The news of Nancy spread across Europe with the speed that important news traveled in the 15th century, which was fast enough to change the thinking of every king and military commander on the continent within months. The lessons were now impossible to ignore. Heavily armored cavalry, no matter how brave or how expensive, could not break disciplined infantry fighting in close formation. The pike and the arquebus together had created a battlefield where knighthood was not just ineffective, it was a liability. Within decades, the standing professional armies of Europe had replaced the feudal levy system almost entirely. Kings no longer summoned their nobles to bring their knights to the field. They hired professional soldiers maintained them year-round, and trained them in the new methods. The feudal bargain, land in exchange for military service, had lost its military logic. And when the military logic died, the political logic began to die with it. Artillery did to castles what pike squares had done to cavalry. The massive stone fortifications that powerful lords had used for centuries to defy royal authority could now be reduced to rubble by artillery trains in days or weeks. King after king used this fact to bring rebellious barons to heel. The balance of power in Europe shifted decisively toward centralized monarchies. The modern nation-state was not born from ideas alone. It was born, in significant part, from the barrel of a cannon. The knight did not vanish in a single day. The titles remained. The tournaments continued for another century. But the reality was settled at Nancy in 1477. Knighthood became ceremony, pageant, history dressed up in steel. The thing itself, the military function that had justified an entire social order, was gone. The age of knights spent 5 centuries dominating every battlefield in the Western world. And then, in less than 100 years, it was over. Not erased in one single moment, but made irrelevant by a world that refused to stay still. The pike, the longbow, the arquebus, the cannon, none of them alone ended the night. But together they exposed a truth that had always been there underneath the shining armor, that no military advantage, no matter how total it appears, survives the arrival of something cheaper, faster, and more adaptable. History does not warn you when an age is ending. It just ends. And the ones who never see it coming, like Charles, face down in a frozen ditch outside Nancy, are always the ones who believed most deeply that nothing would ever change. If this story stayed with you, if you're sitting there thinking about what else history has quietly buried, then you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe right now, because next time we're going back into the fog of history to find another moment the world got turned upside down. Drop a comment below and tell us, which battle do you think changed history the most? We read every single one.